My father said it the way men say things they believe so completely they don't bother lowering their voice. He said it at the dinner table when I was 16, while my brother was telling the family about his summer internship at the firm. He said it again at Christmas when I was 19 and announced I'd gotten into the architecture program at Columbia. He said it at a backyard barbecue the summer I finished my graduate degree, loud enough for the neighbors to hear through the fence. He always said it the same way, with that patient half smile, the one that wasn't unkind but was somehow worse for it. You've got your mother's eye for pretty things, sweetheart, but you're not built for the real world. Your brother is the one who'll carry this forward. 7 years after I walked out of that house in Chicago with 2 suitcases and a check for $800 from my grandmother, a panicked email landed in my firm's inbox. A mid-sized development company out of Chicago was hemorrhaging clients, bleeding money, and begging for a design partnership. Their landmark project, the one they'd staked the entire company's reputation on, was falling apart. The company was called Hargrove Development. The man who signed the email was my father. He had absolutely no idea who was sitting on the other side of that message. I need to tell you how I got here, because a fact without its roots is just a headline, and this story has deep roots. It starts with a drafting table in a suburb of Chicago and a girl who drew buildings the way other kids drew horses, obsessively and for no audience but herself. I grew up in Elmhurst. My father built Hargrove Development from a 2-man crew and a single commercial project into a firm with 40 employees and a reputation in the Chicago metro area. He was proud of that. He had every right to be. He was a self-made man in the most literal sense, and he carried that identity the way some men carry religion completely, gratefully, without room for amendment. His son would continue the legacy. That was never a question. It was simply the shape of the future. Fixed and certain, the way the sun rising in the east is certain. My brother is 4 years older than me. He is intelligent and charming, and from the time he was 16, my father treated him like a junior partner, bringing him to job sites, walking him through blueprints, explaining the business of building rather than the art of it. I used to stand in the doorway of my father's study watching them bent over drawings together, their heads almost touching, and feel something I didn't have a word for at 12 years old. I have a word for it now. Invisible. I wasn't a difficult child. I didn't cause trouble, or fail my classes, or make scenes. I sat at the kitchen table doing homework. And I drew. I drew constantly. Buildings, mostly, but also interiors. The way light would fall through a skylight, I imagined. The proportion of a staircase. The way a hallway could feel like a held breath before it opened into something larger. My mother understood it. She was the one who bought me drafting paper when I outgrew the notebooks, who drove me to the Art Institute on weekends, and stood beside me in front of architecture drawings without checking her phone. She saw something in what I made. She just couldn't say it at the dinner table without my father changing the subject. When I was 16, I entered a regional student design competition. I designed a community library for a neighborhood in the South Side, the kind of building that lets in maximum natural light, that feels safe, that says you belong here in the language of space and proportion. I won first place. The judge wrote that the design showed an intuitive understanding of civic architecture that she rarely saw in students twice my age. I brought the certificate home on a Tuesday. My father looked at it for approximately 3 seconds, said that was very sweet, and then asked my brother what time the contractor meeting was the next morning. That evening, my mother came to my room. She sat on the edge of my bed, the certificate on the desk between us, and she said quietly, like she was telling me something she'd been holding for a long time, "I see what you can do. Don't stop." Then she went back downstairs. I replayed those 5 words more times than I can count over the next decade. The dinner, when everything became official, was the autumn I turned 19. My father announced over pot roast that my brother would be joining Hargrove Development full-time after finishing his MBA. VP of Project Development. His name would eventually go on the letterhead. The family nodded the way families nod at things that were already decided before anyone sat down. My aunt asked what I was planning. My father answered before I could open my mouth. "She's at Columbia for architecture. Very creative program. But you know, the architecture world is tough, very competitive. Your brother has the business head. Claire has the artistic side." He said it warmly. He always said it warmly. Like softening a dismissal with a smile made it something other than a dismissal. I got into Columbia on a full merit scholarship. My father didn't know that. I never told him because I already knew what he would do with the information. Find a way to make it smaller, to locate the ceiling instead of the floor. What followed was 4 years of architecture school, then a graduate program, then the first job, a small firm in Brooklyn that did exactly the kind of work I cared about. Civic buildings, community spaces, structures that held people rather than impressed them. I worked 70 hours a week for 3 years. I got better the way you only get better when you have no fallback and no one watching to tell you it's enough. My father didn't come to my graduate degree ceremony. He had a project groundbreaking that weekend, something my brother was managing, and the timing didn't work. My mother came alone. She wore a pale green dress and carried a handmade sign that I spotted from the processional line before I could stop myself from looking for it. The sign had one word on it: finally. She was crying before my name was called. I was trying very hard not to join her. That evening, sitting in my old bedroom in Elmhurst, waiting for some acknowledgement that didn't come, I heard my father on the phone downstairs, his voice carrying the way it always did. He was talking about a new project. He was talking about my brother. He was talking about the future of Hargrove development. He was not talking about me. I waited one more day. He didn't come upstairs. He didn't knock. The conversation didn't happen. I packed at 11 o'clock at night. 2 suitcases, my drafting materials, my laptop, the framed photo of my mother and me from the day I submitted my graduate thesis. I left my childhood bedroom as I had always kept it orderly, quiet, the drafting table clear. My mother was in the kitchen when I came down. She had the light over the stove on, the small, warm circle of it, the only light in the house. She was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug. She had known I was leaving. She always knew things like that before they happened. We didn't talk for a long time. Then she set down the mug, reached into the pocket of her robe, and slid something across the table. An envelope and a business card. The envelope had $800 in it, saved from years of grocery budgets I will never fully understand. The card was cream-colored, simple. It said Donna Reardon, Reardon Capital Partners, New York. I asked my mother how she had a New York investor's business card. She gave me a small smile and said Donna had been her college roommate 30 years ago, and that they'd stayed in touch in the way that women stay in touch when they know each other's real lives. She said, "Call her when you're ready, not before. When you're ready." I put the card in the back of my wallet. I hugged my mother for a long time in that kitchen, in the light over the stove, and I felt her hands on my back the way you feel something being memorized. Then I picked up my bags and walked out into the September night, and I didn't look back at the house. That was 7 years ago. New York received me the way cities receive people who come with nothing but intention, indifferently, brutally, and with the occasional door cracked open just wide enough to make it worth staying. I sublet a room in Bushwick for $400 a month, a space barely large enough for a bed and the folding table I used as a desk. I worked for a firm in Lower Manhattan during the day, and on my own portfolio at night. I submitted to competitions under my professional name, the one that appeared on my Columbia degree, my mother's maiden name, which I had legally taken as my middle name and quietly started using as my surname when I moved to New York. Not to hide. To be something that was only mine. My father never searched for me. I know because I kept my public professional presence deliberately minimal for the first 2 years, and when I did begin to build it, I used that name. Claire Sutton, not Claire Hargrove. If he had ever typed my name into a search bar, he would have found nothing. He never typed it. The envelope from Donna Reardon sat in my wallet for 11 months. I took it out every few weeks, looked at it, put it back. I was waiting, the way my mother had said to wait, for the moment I actually had something worth showing. That moment came on a Thursday in February, 3 years after I'd left Elmhurst. I had spent 18 months developing a design framework for adaptive civic buildings, spaces that could reconfigure for multiple community uses over decades without major reconstruction. I had a working model, a proof of concept from a small cultural center in Hoboken I'd designed pro bono, and a methodology that my former thesis advisor had described as the most sophisticated approach to civic design flexibility he'd seen in his career. I called Donna Reardon on a Thursday morning from a coffee shop in the West Village. She answered on the second ring. I told her who I was. There was a pause, and then she said, "I know exactly who you are. Your mother sent me photographs of your work every year for 4 years. I've been expecting your call." She asked if I could be in her office the following Monday. I said yes. I had never been in a Manhattan investment office in my life. I bought a blazer that weekend at a consignment shop on Atlantic Avenue and wore it with hands that weren't entirely steady. Donna Reardon was in her early 60s, precise and unhurried, the kind of person who made a room feel calmer by entering it. She had a wall of windows overlooking Midtown and a desk that held nothing unnecessary. She let me present for 40 minutes without interrupting once. When I finished, she asked 3 questions, specific, technical, the questions of someone who had been listening rather than waiting. Then she said, "Here's what I'm willing to do." She wrote a check that afternoon. Not enormous by investment standards, but enough to incorporate, lease a proper studio in Long Island City, and hire 3 people. Her one condition was language I recognized from somewhere I couldn't place. She said, "Build it on the work, not on family, not on connections. I want to see what you can do when the only thing in your corner is what you made." I understood later that my mother had briefed her completely. Sutton Design Studio opened officially in March, 4 years ago. We were 5 people in a converted warehouse space in Long Island City, industrial windows facing west, the Manhattan skyline visible in a way that felt like a target. We submitted for every civic project, every competition, every RFP that came through our category. I was the last one to leave the studio every night for 2 straight years. The moment it turned was a competition for a new public library and community center in Detroit. 83 firms submitted. We won. The city awarded us a $7 million contract, and the architectural press covered it with a specificity that meant they were paying attention. 3 more civic projects followed. Then a major museum renovation in Philadelphia. Then a mixed-use development in Denver that the Times architecture critic described as redefining the vocabulary of community-centered commercial space. By the time the email from Hargrove Development arrived on a Wednesday morning 18 months ago, Sutton Design Studio had 22 employees, a project backlog of 9 figures, and a profile in Architectural Record that ran the previous spring with a photograph of me standing in the Detroit Library, looking at natural light falling through a skylight I had designed at 17 in my bedroom in Elmhurst. Layla, my operations director and the person I trusted more than anyone in the studio, brought the email to my morning review. She had flagged it, as she flagged everything thoroughly, without editorializing. A Chicago development company was in crisis. Their signature project, a mixed-use urban complex called the Hargrove Civic Center, was failing. The design was being rejected by the city planning board for the 3rd consecutive time. They were losing their anchor tenant. The project director had resigned. They were requesting an emergency design consultation with a proposal for a full partnership takeover of the design contract. I read the email once. I set it down. I read it again. The project name was what stopped my breathing. The Hargrove Civic Center. I turned to my computer and typed the address into the city planning database. I pulled up the rejected design schematics. I stopped breathing for the 2nd time in 3 minutes. The organizational logic of the building, the way the central atrium functioned as a distributing hub, the proportional system of the surrounding spaces, the skylight orientation strategy was mine. It was the design framework I had developed in graduate school, refined over the following 2 years, and used as the methodological foundation of every civic project my studio had built its reputation on. The specific spatial grammar was mine. I had never seen it in anyone else's work because it was original to me, developed across 4 years of research, and described in a graduate thesis submitted to Columbia in the spring, 7 years ago. The thesis that had lived on my parents' bookshelf in Elmhurst until I left. I sat at my desk for a very long time. Then I picked up the phone and called Layla. I told her to pull the full financial picture on Hargrove Development. I told her to cross-reference the Hargrove Civic Center project timeline against my graduate thesis submission date. I told her I wanted everything she could find on the company's leadership structure, their current project portfolio, and their principal architects of record. I told her I wanted it before end of day. she asked, carefully, if there was something personal about this one. I said, schedule a meeting. Chicago, get their senior team in person. All of them. Use my professional title. First name only in correspondence. No firm bio attached. She paused the way she pauses when she knows something she isn't asking. Then she said, understood. I sat at the window for a while after she left, watching the light change over Queens. I thought about the thesis on the bookshelf. I thought about the dinner table and the barbecue and the competition certificate that sat on the desk for 3 seconds. I thought about the empty chair at my graduation. I thought about my mother in the kitchen with her hands around a mug and the stove light making a circle around her. I thought about what kind of woman I was going to be when I walked into that meeting. I flew to Chicago on a Thursday and checked into a hotel 12 blocks from the Hargrove development offices. I had not been to Chicago in 7 years. The city looked the same, the way places look the same when you've been changed by everything that happened after you left them. I sat in the hotel room that evening and I went through the materials Layla had compiled, the same way I'd gone through them 4 times on the plane, looking for the thing I already suspected and hoping I was wrong. I wasn't wrong. The Hargrove Civic Center design had been registered with the city planning office in late spring, 4.5 years ago. The architect of record was a man named Curtis Webb, a mid-level designer who had joined Hargrove Development as an in-house architect 2 years before that. His prior portfolio showed competent commercial work, nothing that pointed toward the spatial methodology embedded in the Civic Center plans. The timestamp on the original planning submission file was 18 months after my graduate thesis had been bound and shelved. I turned to page 63 of my thesis. I looked at the diagram. I looked at the Hargrove planning submission. I set both pages on the hotel desk and looked at them side by side. I called Layla at 10:30 at night. I want a full technical documentation comparison, I said. My thesis, specifically chapters 3 and 4, against the Hargrove Civic Center schematics. I want it supported by an independent architectural analyst, someone not connected to us, someone whose opinion would hold up in a legal context. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll have it before the meeting. I said, one more thing. Tonight, search my name. Not my professional name. My birth name. Claire Hargrove. Tell me what comes up in relation to Hargrove Development. She searched while I waited. Nothing, she said. No connection. No mention. That's what I expected. I closed the laptop and lay on the hotel bed in my clothes and stared at the ceiling. The air conditioning hissed softly. Somewhere in the city, in a house in Elmhurst, my father was asleep, and he had no idea that the woman he'd written off was lying in a hotel 12 blocks from his office, with documentation that was about to change the shape of everything he'd built. I didn't sleep much. By 5 in the morning I was reviewing the materials again. By 7 I was dressed. By 8 I was in the Sutton Design Studio conference room. We'd borrowed space at a Chicago co-working facility, going through the room once with Layla, who had driven in from the airport at 6 a.m. with printed documentation and the expression of someone who had connected enough dots to understand that this was not a standard meeting. At 9:55 she came to the doorway and said, "They're in the lobby." I told her to give them 10 minutes to settle. I stood at the window with my back to the room, and I thought about pitch meetings where I'd been told no. I thought about the Brooklyn sublet and the folding table and the consignment blazer and Donna Reardon's phone ringing twice on a February Thursday. I thought about Detroit and Philadelphia and Denver and the woman in the architectural record photograph standing under the skylight she had first imagined at 17. Then I turned around and walked to the conference room. My father was standing at the far end of the table when I came through the door. He was older, heavier through the shoulders. His hair had gone mostly gray at the temples, silver rather than the dark I remembered. He was wearing a charcoal suit and the burgundy pocket square he always wore to serious meetings. I had watched him folded in the hallway mirror 100 times when I was a child. He looked exactly like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had gotten used to the weight. He looked directly at me. He smiled the professional smile. He extended his hand. "Thank you for seeing us on short notice. I'm Richard Hargrove, CEO of Hargrove Development. This is my son, Daniel, our VP of Project Development, and our project architect, Curtis Webb." He took my hand. The grip was the same. Firm, brief. The handshake I had watched him practice with my brother in the driveway when my brother was 14. He had no idea whose hand he was holding. I looked at my brother. He was 34 now, broader than I remembered, the kind of careful confidence that comes from being told you're good at things before you've had to prove it. He shook my hand with the easy charm he'd always had at family gatherings. His eyes moved across my face the way you look at a stranger you find vaguely familiar, something registering below the surface, something not quite connecting. His gaze lingered 1/2 second too long on my eyes. The Hargrove eyes, that particular shade of gray-green my grandmother had and that I'd inherited completely. Something flickered, then it was gone. He smiled and sat down. They hadn't recognized me because I had never looked the way they saw me when I lived under their roof. I wore my hair differently. I carried myself differently, not as a performance, but because 7 years of building something real changes the way you stand in a room. And most importantly, they had never looked at me in the way that makes a face memorable. You don't recognize someone you were never truly watching. Curtis Webb shook my hand without eye contact. His grip was soft. He had the energy of a man waiting to be found out. I sat at the head of the table. Layla sat to my left, tablet ready. They sat across from me, my father, my brother, the architect who had built a career on a methodology that belonged to someone who used to draw buildings at a kitchen table in Elmhurst while they talked about the future in the next room. My father presented. He was good at it. He always had been. He had the cadence and the eye contact and the practiced pauses of a man who had been selling since before I was born. He made Hargrove Development sound like a company in strategic transition, not a company that had staked everything on a stolen design concept and was watching the foundation crack. He used phrases like rethinking our design approach and seeking innovation partnership and unlocking the project's full civic potential. He was careful and composed, and he looked me in the eye with the clean confidence of a man who has never once considered that the woman across the table might know the inside of his house. My brother presented the project development overview, the timeline, the city planning rejections, the anchor tenants' concerns. He spoke the way my father had always spoken in structures, in forward momentum, in the performance of certainty. He had learned from the best. He was good. He just had nothing solid underneath the presentation, and a person who knew how to read a room could feel the hollow places where the real answers should have been. Curtis Webb said almost nothing. He was watching me. He knew something was wrong. He didn't know what shape it was going to take. When they finished, my father leaned back slightly and clasped his hands on the table and looked at me with the expression of a man who has asked for something and is waiting to hear he'll receive it. I let the silence hold for 10 seconds. My father shifted almost imperceptibly in his chair. Then I stood. I walked to the window. Afternoon light was coming through the glass at a low angle, the specific light of Chicago in autumn. And I stood with the light behind me, and they were in shadow, and I took my time. "Thank you for the presentation," I said. It was thorough. I looked at my father, then my brother, then Curtis Webb, then back to my father. "Your project has significant problems. Not only design problems, structural, conceptual problems that 3 planning board rejections have confirmed. A partnership of this nature would require complete transparency from both parties." My father nodded. "We're prepared for full transparency." "Good," I said. "Because before we proceed, I need to disclose something." The room changed temperature. I looked at Curtis Webb. The organizational framework at the core of the Hargrove Civic Center designed the atrium distribution model, the proportional system, the skylight orientation strategy is not original to this firm. I paused. It is original to a graduate thesis submitted to Columbia University in the spring of that year. I have an independent technical analysis here that documents an 81% structural correspondence between the Hargrove schematics and that thesis. I placed Layla's folder on the table. The thesis was written by someone who lived in a house in Elmhurst, Illinois. Someone who left that house 7 years ago with 2 suitcases and the assumption that the work she'd left behind on a bookshelf would remain there. My brother went absolutely still. My father's expression didn't collapse. It changed, slowly. The way a landscape changes when the light shifts the same shapes, suddenly different shadows. He looked at the folder. He looked at Curtis Webb, who had found the pattern in the table extremely interesting. He looked back at me. And then, for the first time in the meeting, He looked at me the way you look at someone, rather than through them. I watched him find it. The eyes first, the particular set of my jaw, the way I stand with my weight slightly forward, the same way my mother stands, the same way he used to notice in her, and never in me. I watched recognition arrive not as a flash, but as a slow, terrible tide, moving across his face the way winter moves across a field. Claire. He said my name, the way you say the name of something you thought was gone. My brother made a sound that wasn't a word. He was looking at me now with his whole face, the charm stripped away, something much more raw underneath. He looked like someone trying to solve a math problem they had been carrying for years without knowing it was a problem. I didn't move from the window. I built a company, I said, on the methodology I developed in graduate school. The methodology that appears in the Hargrove Civic Center plans without attribution and without authorization. I have 7 years of dated project documentation establishing my prior use and public application of that framework. I have the Columbia thesis with its submission timestamp, and I have an independent expert who will confirm, in any forum that requires it, that what is in your planning filings was not invented in this company. Curtis Webb stood up. He said something about needing to step out. Layla stood up at the same moment, placed a second folder on the table in front of him, and said very quietly, "Please stay." He sat back down. My father hadn't taken his eyes off me. The burgundy pocket square. The same one. He looked the way men look when they understand something they have been not understanding for a very long time. "Here are the terms," I said. I walked back to the table and stood at the head of it. Sutton Design Studio will take over as lead architect on the Hargrove Civic Center. We will redesign the project using the original framework's correct application, the one that will actually pass the planning board, because the existing version was implemented by someone who copied the structure without understanding the principles behind it. I looked at Curtis Webb once. He looked at the table. Hargrove Development will credit Sutton Design Studio as the originating design firm. In writing, in the planning filings, in all public project communications, and in the permanent project record, my firm will receive 60% of the design fee for the project. My father nodded slowly. My brother was very still. Additionally, I said, in the project's public documentation, the civic design framework will be credited to its origin, my graduate thesis, my name, not the name I go by now, the name I had when I developed it. Claire Hargrove. My brother's jaw tightened. That's who built the thing your company staked its reputation on, I said. And it will say so on record. Curtis Webb resigned 2 days later. I didn't ask for that, but I wasn't surprised by it. The redesign took 8 months. My team worked from the Chicago studio space we leased for the project, and I was there most weeks, which meant I was in the same city as my father for the first time in 7 years. We met twice during the redesign process, in professional contexts, over project documentation. He was careful and correct, and he listened in a way I had never experienced him listening to me. It wasn't enough to call it repaired. It was enough to call it a start. My brother called me in the 3rd month of the redesign. He asked if I had time to talk. We met at a coffee place in the West Loop, not far from where we'd both been in the same city without knowing it for years. He was already there when I arrived, which told me something. He had his hands wrapped around a mug in the way our mother holds her mug, which told me something else. He said, "I didn't know it was yours." I looked at him. "I want you to know that. Curtis Webb brought the concept to Dad 2 years after you left. I don't know where he got it. I should have asked more questions. I didn't ask enough questions." He stopped. "I'm not saying that to make myself feel better. I'm saying it because it's true, and you deserve to know what I knew and what I didn't." I sat with that for a while. "It was on the shelf," I said. "In the front room. For 2 years before Curtis Webb showed up with it. My brother didn't have an answer for that. The honest ones never do. We sat there for a long time. Not comfortably, not with resolution, but present, which was more than we'd been in 7 years. The Hargrove Civic Center passed the City Planning Board on the first submission under the Sutton redesign. The anchor tenant signed. The local architecture press covered the project launch with a piece that ran the design methodology through its history correctly, from the graduate thesis forward. My name was on the record the way it should have been from the beginning. I flew back to New York on a Tuesday. Layla had flowers on my desk, which she would deny if asked. The studio was working on 3 projects simultaneously. The light through the Long Island City windows was the particular gold of late afternoon, the same light that used to come through my bedroom window in Elmhurst and fall across the drafting table at an angle that made whatever I was drawing look like it mattered. It always mattered. I just had to stop waiting for someone to confirm it. I called my mother that evening from my apartment. She answered on the first ring, the way she always does, the way I think she's been answering since I left quickly, in case it was me. I told her the project had been approved. I told her my name was on the record. I told her about the coffee with my brother. She was quiet for a moment in the way she's quiet when she's feeling something she isn't going to perform. Then she said, "Come home for Thanksgiving." And I said, "Yes." The house in Elmhurst was smaller than I remembered. The kitchen had the same smell. My mother stood at the counter in the same way, with her back to the door, and she turned when she heard me, and she opened her arms, and I was 31 years old and I walked into them anyway. My father was in the front room when I came in. He stood when he saw me. He looked older in the November light, quieter. He didn't give me the one-arm hug and go back to the television. He stood there and he said, without the patient half-smile, without the boardroom voice, without any of the scaffolding he usually stood inside, "I missed you. I am sorry I made it so easy for you to leave. It wasn't everything. It was a beginning. Beginnings are what I build for a living." I know what people expect when they hear this story. They expect me to say it felt like victory, that the planning board approval and the design credit and the room where my father finally looked at me and saw what was there, they expect all of that to feel like the music swelling, like justice arriving with clean symmetry and satisfying weight. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like clarity. The specific, quiet clarity of understanding that the person who made you doubt yourself was working from a fear you couldn't see and a limitation they couldn't admit, and that neither of those things were ever actually about you. I built a company, not because I wanted to prove my father wrong, though I did, and not because I wanted to be sitting across from him when he finally needed me, though I was. I built it because at 17 I stood in front of an art institute drawing of a building and felt something shift in my chest that I recognized as true, and I followed it into every drafting room and studio and co-working space and Long Island City warehouse until it became real. The Hargrove Civic Center opens next spring. My name is on the building. The design credit reads, "Framework originated by Claire Hargrove Sutton, Sutton Design Studio, New York." My mother is flying in for the opening. My brother is bringing his family. My father confirmed last week. He asked, carefully, if that was all right. I told him, "Earn the seat. He's trying. It's not nothing. It might, eventually, be something." I'm still deciding. This story is fictionalized for dramatic purposes.